All we hear is that, over the last, since we started in Amsterdam, we've grown a network of financial advisors that are located around the world that help cross-border people. I remember I met with one of the heads of ING, and he's like, in the Netherlands, he goes, I love the Americans, but they make up 1.5% of my clients. Am I going to change the system just for them? Because every other expat gets reports the same way, right? So no matter where you come from in the world, if you're living in Austria, the Austrian investment authorities don't have to care where you came from, unless you're an American. These are topics we're going to cover tonight. I won't read through them. And then we'll skip around a little bit as well. I've been a financial advisor since 1988. So I'm aging myself to some of the people here. And we had a financial planning firm that was built in New Jersey, and it was really based upon providing financial education. So we would go into corporations like AT&T and IBM and basically provide education to their employees, because at some point in time in the States, companies got rid of pensions and they incorporated things like 401k, where basically it said the responsibility of your finances now lies on the individual versus the corporation. A little bit different in Europe, right, where you have pensions versus in the States. The only people that have pensions really are public service, right? That'll be really the ones, not corporations. Built out a thing on financial education and did that. And the last project, and something I think we're most proud of, is that we ended up working with public service, police officers, teachers throughout the United States with their pensions and their financial planning of, really how do I get from point A to point B? And then in 2016, I had sold that business and wanted to live in Europe. After raising 4 kids, the youngest kid was ready to go to university, and Randy wanted out of town, so moved to Amsterdam. And it ended up, was going to be 1 or 2 years, ended up being 7 years of traveling around Europe and exploring the world. Never lived in Vienna. But it's really there that we started the business model of, because beforehand, all of our clients were domestic, right? So we had offices throughout the United States. It didn't really matter any of the services. The only thing I had to be concerned about may have been state taxes, right? Everything else was kind of the same. And here I moved to Amsterdam and I couldn't open up a bank account. This is 2016. I'm like, what do you mean I can't open a bank account? And my buddy at the time was a senior executive of the company called NXP, and he was forced to liquidate his assets and move it back to the States, and he had a pretty sizable amount. And I'm like, really? They made you move your money? They must be taking this pretty seriously. And it turned out that there was like 90 to 100,000 banks and financial institutions around the world that just didn't want to work with Americans anymore, and for various reasons, not necessarily because of our personalities, but just, oh, come on, but, it came down to, why, and part of it, was obviously the introduction of FATCA, so I'm going to skip over some slides. But that's kind of why we hear is that, over the last, since we started in Amsterdam, we've grown a network of financial advisors that are located around the world that help cross-border people, solve their issues of, hey, I live in Austria, I still have assets in the States, or I'm this and I'm that. I had the same problem when I moved to Paris, for example. We ended up opening a bank account because we opened up a business, and that allowed us to open a bank account. When I went to go move to France for a year, they wouldn't let me open a bank account without a lease, so I had to go spend 6 months up front on a rental agreement to then go to the bank, and they would open a bank account for me. But it's always been very difficult locally. So some of the things we've already talked about, what are the U.S. connected, what does that really mean? These are topics we're going to cover tonight. I won't read through them. And then we'll skip around a little bit as well. But yeah, this is kind of the reason why it all happened, right? FATCA happened in 2014. It's great for business, right? All of a sudden, business had to apply to it. And part of it was, really based upon, as you know, anti-money laundering and afraid of where the money was coming from. The real reason is that they wanted more revenue, right? And how can we get more revenue from people that we don't currently get it? I'm actually very surprised other countries haven't really, put it in yet. But the complication became, as you mentioned, with bank accounts and investment accounts, it's almost as basic as they don't report properly. right? So, if you look at it, if you're in the United States and the IRS, they're going to say, hey, have an investment account. What's dividends? What's short-term capital gains? What's long-term capital gains? And if you don't produce it that way, an investment house or a bank, the client and the bank could get penalized by that. So instead of being in that space, they're like, well, what percent of the population is Americans in Austria, and therefore why should a bank care? Or an investment bank care? I remember I met with one of the heads of ING, and he's like, in the Netherlands, he goes, I love the Americans, but they make up 1.5% of my clients. Am I going to change the system just for them? Because every other expat gets reports the same way, right? So no matter where you come from in the world, if you're living in Austria, the Austrian investment authorities don't have to care where you came from, unless you're an American. So in the needs of the absence of dealing with that, it's easier to say no, right? Is it a missed business opportunity? Maybe, but that's kind of the answer, right? Why bother becomes the question, because the amount of the population here and the amount of assets compared to the locals and every other expat that comes live here, they don't have to worry about the problem. So the guy from ING is like, well, if I take on Americans, I got to redo my whole technology thing to be able to report exactly the way the IRS wants, right? And has anybody here had PIFIX in the past? A PIFIC? Where you get, hi, by the way. Has that been cleaned up at this point? Are you familiar?
I guess we'll find out.
Right. Right. So the law became punitive, right? To the point where nobody wanted to be involved. So, as an example, if I made a $100,000 investment, and it grew to $200,000 in 2024, well, in the United States, maybe in that $100,000 growth, 10,000 was dividends and some short-term capital gains, and the rest of it may have been just the stock went up, right? So it went up, and that happens. But now, as a PIFIC, you're paying taxes on that whole amount, regardless of the gains being realized or the short-term gains at the highest U.S. income bracket, which is quite a bit. A PIFIC is an investment that you hold here. It's called Passive Foreign Investment Corporation, is the technical boring word. It basically means it's a foreign-held investment, which is why foreign companies will not take you on as clients, because their reporting will not be compliant with the IRS, and therefore that client will be put into a punitive tax situation from the very beginning. So there's become, part of what, as a firm, hey, you have investments overseas, you have investments in the States, what are your options? So there are options now. The options, tend to be for higher net worth at times than the mass population, but that's because of the banks and the investment firms, the cost of dealing with that stuff. So, that's kind of why we're in this place of, in the middle of the screen, with FACA. And this slide would have been a year or two old. So usually it's people with PIFIX are kind of like, well, I just hope they never find me. That's usually the attitude. I hope they don't find me, because, and it's also the reason why when you're talking to financial advisors here, they won't be dealing with the U.S. stuff, because they're used to their own situation. So part of my story in Amsterdam would have been discovering that as an American there, when I went to go speak to a Dutch financial advisor, they knew everything about the Dutch system, pensions, otherwise, but they weren't licensed and knew anything about the U.S. system. If you ask the U.S. financial advisor, they'd be like, what would I know about the Dutch system? They'd only kind of know where they're at. So the idea was to marry it, and provide and maybe the whole point of MyExpatInvest is to provide that full holistic service where your accounting and your financial plan, not just investments, on a cross-border way are harmonized, and you're always people speaking to each other in the right track in both things, versus different professionals kind of trying to do their best for you but not being able to communicate that way or being properly licensed. That'd be a good advertisement, a commercial for our company. This will be some of the things we'll cover, and like I said, probably more in your comment sheets at the end. I've had some questions of, hey, in the U.S., what am I allowed to buy? If I can open up an account. So we'll cover a little bit of that, but you may want to have specific questions afterwards. So not to belabor the point of a financial advisor, it really is as simple as where are you today compared to where you want to go? What are your goals and objectives? Is it my retirement? Is it education of children, which is more of a U.S. problem? Is it buying a house? And, basically a snapshot of what's my financial situation look like today? What's my cash flow, my assets, liabilities, relative to my goals and objectives? And what needs to be done to make sure that they're aligned. It's almost as basic as that when you look at it. And it's completely goal alignment. So, some of the things that you need to take into consideration would be, what is important to you? What's going to be those things? When you look at yourself, a lot of the history of investments, for all the time I've been doing investments with people, it tends to come down to more emotion and personality and the history of that person than the actual intellectual part of it. What's important, what's someone's risk relative to who they are. Part of being here today, taxation, inflation are going to be, probably the two biggest things as you get into retirement, especially that can kind of knock you backwards and not let you reach those goals or inhibit them. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on, things like life insurance, or if that's a necessary thing, and a little bit of education on it. But that'll be kind of what we look to do. If anybody has a piece of paper, I'm going to use this a couple of times tonight. It's a very basic mathematical formula. So if people are not familiar with it, I'll go through it. And basically what it means is how fast it takes your money. And by the way, in the comment sheets, if anybody wants a copy of these slides, just put them down. And instead of taking pictures, we'll be happy to send you a copy. Is how fast it takes your money or your expenses to double. So if you're going to earn 6% of your money and you had $10,000, euros, pounds, wherever it is, that means in 12 years from now, that 10,000 is worth 20. And in 12 years from then, it's worth 40. That's the simple math of it. If you look at, for investments, the same thing. If you look at things like the cost of inflation and things like that, if you wanted to use inflation at 4%, just for today's example, I know inflation has been high the last couple of years, but statistically it's about 4% for the last 100 years. So if you look at that and you said, hey, I'm 60 years old and my cost of life is $60,000. Well, unless things change, I use flat inflation. That means when I'm 78, it's going to cost me $120,000. And if I live to be 96, is that the right math? I think so. It's going to be, $240,000. So it's a mathematical formula that you can take home and use in any way you want to calculate things. And we're going to use that a couple of times tonight. The other part of it, as you mentioned, already is longevity. Even if I pop to the next slide and go back, we got recently from the United Kingdom, and you can see in 1900, people were expected to live to age 45 as an average. And one of the reasons, and now life expectancy is in the 80s. So one of the reasons why things like Social Security and pensions in the United States went away is people living longer than ever. In fact, it's possible to have a longer retirement lifetime than you did a working lifetime. So you have to work for X amount of years and financially be able to support yourself for all those years afterwards. So right now, as you can see, the percentage chance of living is going to be into your 90s. And, there's an assumption now that, a baby born now would live to be over 100, right? Which, is pretty interesting, especially if you get married at 30. But, yeah, right. They say life take you apart. They don't put like 90 years on it, right? I mean, that might change things a little bit. I'm like, 90 years, really? But that becomes the issue of, when I retire, in this example, I have to figure out how does my income match up with the fact that over those years, my expenses are going to be going up. But yet, if you get Social Security, it's about half of inflation. It goes up every year. And pensions usually aren't geared towards inflation either. Right, so they tend to stay flat. So how do you kind of make up that difference if you live too long, right? Because it comes down to, do you pass away, or do you live and you live too long? And without that knowledge, it becomes now even more difficult for people retired to figure out, because going back to the other slide is when the U.S. put in things like Social Security, At 65, people only living to be like 72. They only had to worry about 7 years, 8 years of funding. Same thing came with pensions for the U.S. companies. I'm only reflecting the U.S. I can't speak to the Austrian space. Of, back in the day, you had General Motors and AT&T had these big pensions, but then what ended up happening, there was more people retired, taking down a pension, and the legacy costs of that became too much. And the more people are going to live, the longer they have to make those payments. So it became a mathematical formula of we'd rather make a contribution and match a 401k, for example, than be on the hook for pension formers because we don't know how long people are going to live now. They once upon a time didn't live so long. Now that who knows, right? And the same thing, using inflation. An election was just lost because of inflation to some extent. The cost of goods became so much that people were having trouble living day by day. And for years, inflation was under check, for really the whole 2000s. We had a financial crisis at the end of the 1990s, and then in 2008, then COVID. So the governments interest rates stayed zero for a very long time, right? Where you couldn't make any money in a bank account. They were very low, and inflation was low because the bank accounts will be relative to where inflation is. But then you can see, over the last couple of years, it rose to 7-8% on average. Well, 8% means that going back to the rule of 72, my 50,000 at 60 is now going to cost me 100,000 in 9 years, and that's a pretty big difference. And we know for sure that employment salaries and pensions aren't going to keep up with that. So that becomes what happened at that point in time. And the most critical thing for you to do for retirement is to always make sure you're above inflation. But it's not quite as simple as that, as I say it out loud. It has to make sure that you're above inflation after taxes, right? So if you make an investment and your investment earns, for example, 6%, and you have to pay 1/3 in taxes, you didn't really make 6, did you? You made 4, right? So using 4 towards your lifestyle, and it becomes, what does your lifestyle cost you? So it's the real thing that you put into your pocket, not, what would actually, you see on your statement of 6%, what was the tax benefit or non-benefit for that? And when you look at inflation, and I'm sorry for people in retirement, which is, I'm of the age too, where usually inflation retirement is 1 or 2% higher than other inflation. Well, at least in the States it is, because of the poor medical facilities having to pay for medicine and things like that. So when you look at the inflation, it is a little bit higher, but the truth is it's all individual. On the flip side, you could buy a computer for a fraction of the cost you could 10 years ago. So not everything's inflation-wise. Cars haven't been going up as much, but the things been going up as much have been, things that we need, like food. So the cost of a car hasn't, but the insurance has, So when you look at it, and part of even going back to the beginning of a financial plan is, you're going to want to get an assessment of what your expenses are, right? Like, I'm not an exact person, but depending on who you are, but you want to have an idea of how much your expenses are going to be, especially getting to retirement, and which expenses are going to stay or not stay as you get into retirement, to know what to apply towards your income and your financial, assets are going to support it. These already come up already, is there a solution? Portability, that usually means things like, if you have a pension in one country, it has to stay there. If you have a 401k in the States, you can't roll it over, or an IRA in the States into an Austrian plan. If you end up with an Austrian pension, it'll stay in Austria. So, we've seen a lot of times, because, when you're in the cross-border world, sometimes it'll be people who go to a country and stay. Other times it might be a corporate person that bounces from 5 years in one place, 7 years in another place. Every place they are, they may have access, and have social welfare or a pension in that place. So, how do you all figure that out? And all those assets have to count towards your, financial future. Okay. As an example, when you using before and jumping a little bit of the Rule of 72, when you look at some of your investments, some of the choices you're going to have are, do I invest my money inside or outside a retirement account, 401k, IRA, whatever it might be. Annuity in the States where, something's tax deferred versus, taxable. So one of the most powerful things that you do have for, especially for retirement, is the power of, we'll call it tax deferral. Hey, and that basically is, what does that really mean, having the power of tax deferral? So I'm going to use an example here to kind of illustrate that. Let's say that, let's use an example for a second that I make an investment inside of an IRA and outside an IRA. Same exact investment, right? One's tax deferred, one's taxable. Just the basic of the thought process. So I'm going to use math that works for me, which is I earn 9% on the investment, but I pay 1/3 in taxes. So after taxes, I'm netting 6. Is that okay? So this way the path will work from before. It could be 6-4. It's just an illustration purpose. So I make an investment, same exact investment. Now we're just talking about the tax consequence of it. My $100,000 investment is now invested outside of an IRA, and therefore it made 9, but it netted 6. So back to the rule of 72, that means my $100,000 after 12 years is worth $200, right? And then my $100,000 after 24 years is worth $400 after tax, okay? Now, in my tax deferred account, I'm earning 9, right? So that means every 8 years my number doubles. So math, 100 after 8 years is 200, after 16 years is 400, after 24 years is how much? $800,000, right? So there's twice as much money in the same exact investment here as there is over here, right? And what's the catch? The catch is you have to take it out at some point, right? So it's tax deferred, not tax free, not foreign resident income. Sorry to go down that way. So here I have $400,000 for retirement that I've put away after tax. Here I have $800,000 for retirement that I've put into IRAs or 401ks during my life. And the catch is that this I haven't paid taxes on yet, right? So eventually I have to pay taxes on it. So to really illustrate this point, hopefully not going to, is that I'm going to take the money out in one shot, okay? I'm going to pay 33% in one shot, keep the same taxes. Now, would I really do that? No, if I got $800,000 here, I need 50, I would take out 50. But I'm going to take out all 800 because I'm in Vienna. My wife's like, why are you in Vienna? And I'm sitting in New York. So she's going to be like, when you're done in Vienna and want to go around the world for a couple of years, take out the 800,000. Pay the 33% in taxes, which means I have to write a check to the government for about 240,000. I write that check to the government. I had 800,000 here. I took out that 240,000. How much do I have left? $560,000. How much did I have over here? 400. I have 40% more money for my retirement by simply using a tax deferral. Same investment, it's not an investment structure, it's tax deferral, and I'm doing all the wrong things by doing it. So yes, sir, when you withdraw the money, it will be taxed. When you look at retirement, it's not when you retire, it's going to be, I'm going to live for 20, 30 years. So I got to stop thinking about it as I'm retired today, is what does my retirement lifetime look like, which is why you leave things tax deferred as long as possible. So when you go to liquidate money for retirement, you tend not to take it out of your IRA first. You tend to leave your IRA until the minimum distribution time, if possible. If you need the money, it's liquid for you, but in a financial sense, the longer you leave it there, the better off you'll be at the end result. An examples of that would be working with MyExpatInvest, that they've heard, as now it's in the beginning, some of the questions that you've had. How do I contribute to an IRA? How do I open up an account from overseas? And those are things that as a team we're working on to provide a very easy solution. Right now the solutions are to be they're a little clunky, more of an individual basis versus a real streamlined solution that we'll have in place in short order. So somebody can open up an account in the United States, or somebody can contribute to an IRA from Austria. So right now I think I realize those are difficult things, but that's something that, will be worked on and is available now, and will be available on a mass basis pretty shortly. Okay. It's kind of what we talked about already a little bit, when you get into things like retirement, what are the risks? It's going to be, how long you live, what is inflation, how well do your investments do, and then, basically when you do pass, what does that look like? What's your survivorship plan? What's your estate planning look like to make sure you can leave behind as much to your family or whoever you want to versus governments, and that'd be part of the plan. Let's see. So we covered some of these things. I'm jumping around a little bit because maybe this goes to a little bit more what you were saying. So, it becomes, I saw an interesting presentation last week on the psychology of investing where, here's the firm belief that how you grow up depends upon how you invest, and my grandfather was a depression kid. My mother was very, very conservative. She was always worried that things were going to go wrong, and so how you grow up and where you grow up and those things and the circumstances you grow up can indicate, what risk you want to take, more so than, I know the stock market's going to go up by 9% the next 10 years, no matter how much it goes down, so that becomes that. And when you look at it, this, where you look at the different range of investments from conservative to more aggressive, and there's obviously a trade-off with that. But then, you start looking at going back to what do portfolios look like depending upon your risk tolerances. There's a very basic formula saying, hey, using just 3 categories, and obviously look around the room, you don't fit into a category of just one of these 3. There'll be parts of different. But in this case, if you look at a conservative, a moderate, or aggressive portfolio, you can see the different balances of how much you would have. And even in the area of stocks, going back to what you said, there's green energy stocks, then there's AT&T or in blue chips, and how volatile is a stock going to be versus right now, I saw the other day, the top 7 NASDAQ stocks have a greater value than like 40 countries, like stocks, and talk about, any kind of conspiracy theories about corporations, but, look how much power they control by being in that position. So when you look at equities, you will look at the span of equities, just like bonds, what's conservative versus what's aggressive in that area. And depending upon, where you are would depend upon, which kind of portfolio you would have. The tricky part comes in that, when you make an investment or you do a financial plan, it's like it starts from that point but doesn't continue to that point, right? So what changes every year is, what does your balance look like? So some of the things that we've seen that people have made mistakes with, as an example, or not on purpose, I should say, is, and especially if you have accounts like a 401k or an IRA in the States. Does anybody have that in the States? And, and a lot of the custodians are, well, you make changes, right? If you have a 401k in the States and you leave the country, it's pretty hard to move that 401k into an IRA. You have to go through some extra work. But that 401k, you're not allowed to change things around, or maybe you made investments, you just left it. So when you pick a balance, in this case, it was the moderate investor, and they had initially a very good balance of relative to their goals and objectives. But if they don't do anything for 5 years, you can see that's out of balance, right? That even though the stock market did very well for those years, well, now I have 88% or 57% when I wanted to start with 50. So I have more in the equity position than I meant to. And even though it did very well, I'm now out of balance, and I'm now subject to a potential shock in the stock market because my balance is not there with what I originally wanted it to be there. And I left it. And usually that happens because there's accounts you can't get in touch with. You're not sure what to do. Well, just doing well, you're like, okay, let's do it well until I have a gut feeling it's not going to do well, which is, works. Yeah. Well, the next topic was really going to be on things like life insurance and estate planning. I'm not sure how much it matters here. Is anybody going back? Anybody go back to the States? Anybody's here? Is that? Anybody go back to the States sometime?
Like permanently?
No, just to visit and stuff like that. Well, everybody does. Okay, so we can talk about it. Although maybe it won't work here. Is when you look at, one of the questions that have come up, like it would come up any place really is, we talked before what happens if I live, and the second question is what happens if I don't live, and what do I need to do to protect that, right? And when you look at things like passing away, it assumes that you leave here tonight and some crazy tram driver hits you, and what's really important to you, right? I mean, I took the tram the last couple of days, and I'm a lost soldier in this city. It goes this way. I'm looking at it going, the map says this way. And I'm like, why is it going further away from my destination? And yeah, it's beating me, a little bit in that. But when you look at it, there's really, three important things to think about. But there's also a very big tax advantage to it. But I don't know if it actually works in Austria. So I'll explain the tax advantages, and you can say yes or no. But if you don't live in Austria, it would be a great tax advantage, which shouldn't make you move to Germany. Same, right? Check. You just go north. So when you look at life insurance, you kind of like, hey, what happens and what's important to me? And there's three things to consider, really. One is, do I have any debts and liabilities I want to leave behind to somebody else? Two is, especially in the States, me for 4 kids, if I wanted to educate my kids, would I also want to see them educated in case something happened to me? And then 3 is, I pass away, and what would my surviving spouse need if she needs anything, for that? And they're really just 3 analytical questions, and you basically come up with, hey, I need $300,000 of life insurance. I need nothing. I need $700,000, and that becomes an analytical number. And one of the things that it does do, I'm going to bounce back up, is when you look at insurance, and the reason why I'm asking if you go back into the States, because it's more of a state-driven process as far as buying things like life insurance versus being able to get it here. A U.S. proposition in that case. And most of the time when you're looking overseas, you're probably familiar with some of these terms. Living in the States, term insurance, where basically, hey, if I pay an amount every year, $200. If I don't die, I didn't use it, I got to pay $200 next year. So it's a term, and every year you don't use it, which is good. You keep paying for it. To the point of down the below is the more of the cash value insurances, which is a very big benefit if somebody needs life insurance. So I'm not saying you do this for tax benefit, but if it's a need for life insurance. So when you look at it, let's say when you look at the combination, if term insurance costs $200, permanent insurance costs $1,000, just to use those numbers. Now the difference is the $800 grows tax deferred while it's in the insurance policy. Now, what's kind of a strategy about that is that you're allowed to pay more into that than what they require. So let's use that example of $1,000 policy. Somebody could put in $10,000 into that policy versus $1,000. Still costs the same $200 of insurance. The difference is all this money now is invested on a tax-deferred basis. The whole $10,000 invested. Now, so in normal tax-deferred accounts, the money will keep growing, and then when you take the money out, you're paying withdrawal fees. In this case, if I put away the $10,000 a year, let's say for 10 years, and I have $100,000, no growth, no nothing, just to make the math easy, $100,000. Statistically, I'd have to pay money on the tax-deferred growth. In this case, what U.S. life insurance companies, U.S. tax code, is you're allowed to borrow your own money from your insurance policy. If you borrow your own money, it comes out tax-free. So people use that to supplement education goals and retirement goals if they had an insurance need, usually younger, where you overfund life insurance, not for the need of the protection, but for the tax savings of it, where eventually it'll grow tax deferred all those years. Any growth will go tax deferred. When you borrow, when you take the money out, it's no longer income. It's borrowing against the insurance policy in the United States. After 10 years, they charge 0 interest to borrow your money, so you take a tax-free, interest-free of your own money. And that becomes a tax-free withdrawal for retirement or goals. Good strategy. If you need life insurance, you need to buy it offshore. There's very limited options in U.S. companies. I'm asking for the States if somebody needs it. Everybody will want to sell life insurance in the States to somebody who comes and signs paperwork in the States, basically. So that's a tax benefit. Does that actually work?
I can't comment on how Austria would tax that.
Okay. We'll find out. But that, if anybody does have a need for that, I wanted to cover that in tonight's seminar as well in session. One is that, as far as coming here to have a conversation with the financial advisor, complimentary consultation, get your questions answered. The questions you have tonight, I'll make sure you get answered. But if you do want to sit down with somebody, sit down would be Zoom right now. To have a one-on-one with the financial advisor who understands cross-border stuff, you'll have an opportunity through the website to ask for that. And there's the thing that you can do it as well. I'm not sure how it works, but it does work. And with that, appreciate a couple of other things. I mentioned no negative feedback. I'm still serious about that one. But this is our first seminar, and we're planning as a entity to do ongoing seminars and webinars. So all looking for some feedback on some topics that you think would be valuable. And if you have any feedback on tonight that you'd like to give, please do. So one is, if you'd like to request a complimentary consultation, that would be awesome for business stuff. That's why we're here. But, we're here for the duration. We're going to be doing a lot of educational things. So please, any kind of feedback that you think would be valuable, we'd love to provide that. And we're going to have a regular newsletter coming out that you'll be able to, get information and reach out to somebody as well.